Welcome back to another video where we will continue working our way through the settings in BenchEzy Advanced. In this tutorial we are going to look at our defaults section. We can drop that down and we can see that it's broken up into 4 sections: joins, user, material, allowances and company. First section we will look at is joins. Now, as a hint, you can open up some help diagrams which will explain to you what each of these measurements is talking about. The first one we're going to look at is the mason's miter approach length. We can find down there in our drawings here that the approach length that we're talking about on a mason's miter is the distance from where the angle approach cut starts and finishes. So that is the length of that machining line. Most mason's miter joins, or when you think about the old aluminium joiner jigs, the distance from the face of the join to the start of this point used to be 23 millimeters. That mathematically calculates out to pretty close to 32.1 millimeters. I always run my settings at the 32.1. That way it gives me the added advantage that if for some reason we have to run a join using our old aluminium mason's miter joints, our 2 joins will actually still then fit together. Next one is the radius. The radius is talking about the radius of the blend between the approach machining and the join face machining. Again, I have mine set at 10 millimeters, which again lines up with the old aluminium mason's miter jigs. The next one we're talking about is a bastard miter approach length. That is the same principle as we have already spoken about with the normal mason's miter. Again, the radius is the same. In this instance, I have this one particular one set to 12. The next one we're going to look at is a football size. Now, the football size is, if you can imagine, when we have a bench top that is a miter join and it is rolled on both the front and the rear edges, quite often a lot of people will actually line up the front rolls on those 2 bench tops, join them up and then cut the back corner roll to alleviate having the extra hassle of trying to make sure that those 2 bench tops are exactly the same width so that we end up with a nice join around the back roll. So what this dimension here does is tells BenchEzy how big a corner we want to chop off in that particular application. So basically what it's telling us is that we measure from the edge of the top. So if we can assume for a minute that this here is the back corner of a joined bench top, we are measuring from the front edge of the top, which is from the edge of the top here to the point here where the football corner is to finish. So basically it's the distance from the edge of the top to that point there. The next area we're going to talk about will be to do with joiner bolts. BenchEzy Advanced gives you the option of being able to actually rotate your join bolt patterns. Now obviously this is our join bolt pattern here, so if we were to switch this on, when we are doing either a male or a female mason's miter, our joiner bolts will be actually rotated so that the female top is actually going to be able to pull the male join into the female join a little bit better. We then set here the actual number of degrees rotation that we would like the bolt to be rotated. Next thing we're talking about is the housing depth. Now, the housing in the joiner bolt operation is this area here in the joiner bolt. That's where your bolt toggle will actually sit, your zip bolt sits, that's the housing. So in our case here, we want the housing to be 20 millimeters in depth. The next area we're going to talk about is the trench. Now, the trench is this section here where we can machine from the center of the housing to the face of the join. And in this case here, I have mine set at 12 millimeters in width and 17 millimeters in depth. Next we'll look at our center measurements. Now the first one is from the front of the bench top. So I'm having mine set up at 65 millimeters, which is from the front of the bench top to the edge of the joiner bolt housing. So regardless of what type of joiner bolt housing it is you use, BenchEzy will automatically keep the distance from the front of the bench to the edge of the joiner bolt housing at that 65 millimeters that I have it set here. And the same then applies from the rear of the bench. So if we're looking here that this is the rear of our bench here, this is the distance from the rear of the bench to the edge of the join bolt housing. Next one is from the edge of the join. When your bench top is machined, this is what we call here the join face or the edge of the join. So what we're talking about here is in this setup, I want my center of my join bolt housing to be 42 millimeters from the center of the housing to the face of the join. And then the last setting on this page is the maximum spacing. This is the maximum distance apart that you require your join bolts to be. The smaller you set that setting, the more join bolts you will have in each join. BenchEzy automatically calculates the number of joiner bolts to put in any join length based upon the combination of these measurements that we've talked about here. The next section we're going to look at is the defaults for the user. Quite a lot of settings here to work our way through, but we will just continue working our way through one at a time. The first one, file name on drawings. What that does tells BenchEzy whether you would like or not like to have the file name displayed on the drawing when BenchEzy generates the drawing for you. The next one is the dimensions on the drawing. Again, whether you would like to display the dimensions on the drawing when BenchEzy generates the drawings for you. The next one, ask before clearing. Once the benchtop has been generated, it's been approved, code has been generated, this switch here tells BenchEzy to ask before it clears the drawing, ready to commence a new one. The bird's eye setting, what that does, when the bench is first generated, BenchEzy will display a drawing that is looking at it in plan view. Now, remembering that all our bench tops are machined upside down, sometimes it can be a bit difficult to interpret that bench top because we're looking at upside down. So by having this switch turned on, BenchEzy will show us an approval drawing in actual plan view that we can use. Kill alpha edit is just a setting that is basically required there. On some people's machines, the alpha edit component doesn't automatically shut itself down. This one here, in this setting, ensures that that does happen. The machining, trim the top depth. Where you would use this setting is if you were to be buying in your benchtop substrate in, say, 610 millimeter wide rips, but the finished product size of your benchtops is 600. By turning this switch on, BenchEzy will automatically apply machining to the rear edge of every bench to make sure that when that bench comes off the machine, it is at its finished size of 600 millimeters. The next switch, tool sorting. What this does, before BenchEzy generates code for any benchtop, it goes through and sorts out the tooling operations. It optimizes them in such a way that it minimizes the number of tool changes required for the machining of any particular benchtop. Mostly, I would assume that this would be switched on because it's going to save over a period of time, considerable time, with your actual machining operations. The next switch, football corners, is a default setting that if you always do your mitered joins where your benches roll front and rear, and you always cut that back corner off, turn this switch on and BenchEzy will automatically apply the machining for you to do that. Easing of top joins. What some people like to do is, if you can imagine that we are joining two bench tops, we're basically butting two 33mm surfaces together. So what they like to do is to actually ease out each face so that we may only have, for example, 5mm of the top section of the join butting and 5mm on the bottom section of the join cutting. This would require a specialized tool to be purchased to make sure that the tool doesn't foul on the bed of a nesting machine or pod machines, if in actual fact as well. The next switch is for biscuit grooving. The same thing applies, that some people prefer to run a biscuit groove along the face of each joint so that they can then put biscuits in there to help get their joins to line up correctly. A couple of miscellaneous settings here, whether we would like to create reports or DXFs. When these switches are turned on, BenchEzy will automatically create a DXF file and some reports for each and every single bench. The DXF files are quite often can be used for importing into other software packages for different purposes. Some benchtop standard sizes. This is the most common size that you would manufacture your benchtops in, and in general would be 600. For your wide benchtops, depending on how you machine or manufacture your benchtops, this may be that you buy in 910mm wide blanks, you don't machine the front and rear edges, so then in theory your finished benchtop size in a survey application is 910. If you were to be still buying in the same 910 blanks, but you machine the face and the rear, or one or the other or both, and the finished size of your bench turns out to be 880mm, this is where you can set that setting, and BenchEzy will by default throw that in there every time a survey bench is being generated. default thickness of the bench top. Most of us use a 33mm substrate, then adding on to that the thickness of the laminate gives us the 34mm thickness of bench. If we were by default using a 38mm thick substrate, we would then take our 38mm, add our thickness of 1mm for laminate, and that would be 39mm. Joining top widths. This is some default measurements for a top that will join onto the top that you are actually generating on the left-hand end. So we might be machining a sink top, for example, but on the left-hand end of this sink top we have another bench top that joins in that has the hot plate in it. So again, depending upon our default sizes in your environment, this could be 600, it may be 610. Then the same principle applies for a bench top that joins on the right-hand end. Some window piece default sizes. Now, the definition of a window piece is where the bench top actually has to run into the window and either sit under or butt into the aluminium of the window behind your kitchen bench. So basically what we're doing here, we want a standardized width of 120mm and then a finished thickness of 17mm. Now that's the finished thickness, so that becomes the distance from the top face of the laminate on top of the bench down to the underside of the substrate that runs into the window. Next thing we're talking about here is some join jig corner sizes. A join jig is, if you can imagine, when you do a mason's miter, and just a normal male mason's miter, we get that little 45-degree corner chopped off on the front of the join. That is basically what I'm calling a join jig corner. Now, join jigs may quite often be used on the ends of servery benches, for argument's sake, or the front corner of a bench so that a corner pantry door doesn't hit on the bench when it's opened. That's the type of thing we use a join jig corner for. So when we're talking about our join jig sizes, we'd look, the first measurement we need to fill in is the length. Now that is the distance from the end of the bench to the end of the join jig corner machining operation. We then look at the width. This is the distance measured from the front of the top towards the back of the top, and then this is the radius of the actual blend between the angle machining and the end machining. Next we look at a clipped corner. Clipping the corner is quite often used where we might have a breakfast bar and we need to knock the rear corner off the exposed end of the breakfast bar. So what we can do here is we can set a default size for the length and for the width. Now any of these sizes that we're actually entering here are only purely a default size. All of these dimensions can be overridden on the fly as we're actually constructing a bench top. Now we're talking about bench tops that have curves in them. When we're doing generally it's a servery bench with a curved end on it, this is the height that we would like the curve to be. Again, these dimensions can be overridden on the fly, and if we were doing a servery with a curved rear edge, by default using this measurement it would be 100mm. Next thing we're going to look at is banjos. Now a banjo is basically a vanity top where it extends across the end of the bath. Now when we're looking at a banjo top, you can imagine we're standing looking at our vanity, and now let's assume that our bath is on the left hand side. That would be then a left-hand banjo. If our bath was on our right-hand side, that would be a right-handed banjo. So basically what we're talking about here is the offset radius. Now that's the radius of the blend between the machining that changes the depth from the actual finished depth of the vanity section of the bench, and it blends back to the finished depth of the banjo arm. The standard angle, now the angle is the angle from which we want BenchEzy to machine from the full depth of the cabinet section of the top back to the narrow section of the banjo arm. By default, the standard depth of the banjo arm, I would like that to be 300mm. Again, these dimensions can be overridden on the fly when you're machining a banjo vanity top. Some miscellaneous amounts here. Now, every time we manufacture a bench top, we should always make it slightly oversized so that when we put it onto our machine for machining, it actually gets trimmed up and it is completely finished size when it comes off. So we can then have a setting here which we will by default be machining off our trim. Now our trim is the amount that will be machined on the point of origin end of our bench. So if our machine has a point of origin in the rear left, what this is saying is here that we will be butting our bench top up against the stops on the left hand of our machine and against the rear of our machine, but the finished bench will, after it has been machined, will actually be 10mm off the pins. Another miscellaneous setting here is a default angle for a servery. Now what we're talking about here is that if you can imagine we have a 2 meter wall wall, and then that wall returns away from you at 90 degrees, but on that 2-meter wall we have to place 3 meters of floor cabinets, which means that we will have a 1-meter servery on the end of that bench. So basically what this is a default angle that we want to assume any time the wall changes direction where a servery is involved. Quite often it is generally 90 degrees, but you can have this set to whatever it is that you like. Again, this angle can be overridden on the fly when you're actually creating that type of particular bench. The last setting we need to look at on this page is the default output path, where we want BenchEzy to place all of our output files. Now this is simply a Windows path. We can use the browse button to find the location, but we must keep in mind that when BenchEzy generates a benchtop, BenchEzy will automatically create a folder below this path which is named, whether it be the builder or your job number, and then below that again we'll create another folder which could be the job address or your work order number. So that covers this page of the defaults for the user. We will move on now and have a look at the next section of the defaults area, which is the material allowances. Now in this area is where we set up the allowances that we require BenchEzy to add to all of our laminate and our substrate when it calculates out what sizes we need to cut our raw materials at. It also sets up whether we actually want BenchEzy to do it for the board or the laminate or both or one of the other. So now when we're talking about our substrate allowance, we have a rolled edge allowance here, so that when we run a piece of substrate through our spindle molder, we obviously will lose a little bit of material off the width of our top. So if we were to be making a standard 600 millimeter bench top and it was to be rolled on the front edge only, but it must finish at 600 millimeters in width, in theory, if we were losing 2 millimeters when we machined our roll, we would need to at least cut that piece of substrate at 602 millimeters. Same principle again, but this is for a rear edge allowance. So again, talking about our 600 millimeter bench, we're going to allow 200 millimeters to be machined off with the roll, but we still want to trim that back edge of that bench as well to make sure that it is nice and straight after it comes off our machine. So in this case we've got an allowance of 4 millimeters. The trim amount for a rolled edge, that particular measurement there is for people that use, for argument's sake, a beam saw. Now they may buy in 36/18 sheets of substrate. They may rip those down to 620 millimeters and then run them through the spindle and run them through the post-forming process. So they still want to be able to use a beam saw but still leave enough excess to be able to then still have these other allowances available to them. The last one is the trim amount for a square edge. So if we were going to manufacture a set of bench tops that were square edged along the front, one way we could do it would be just to take our piece of substrate, edge strip it, lay our laminate and machine it. But some people prefer to make sure that the front edge of that bench substrate is perfectly straight. So basically what we're talking about here is again an allowance to add to our finished benchtop size to give us some material to cut off, so that when BenchEzy calculates out our substrate size, all of these allowances are taken into account. Next thing we're going to look at is our laminate allowances. Now if you remember back to the video that we did where we were setting up our bench edge profiles, in that area we had to have a setting in there on how much laminate to allow for each particular type of roll. In this area here we are actually now covering the extra allowance that we want to be allowed on the rear edge of a bench. Now we might have again our 600 millimeter wide bench top. We might have set up a 180 degree roll where we've told it in the bench edge profile section that we must allow 65 millimeters, and then we want another 10 millimeters of a laminate to be overhanging at the back of the bench ready for us to trim off. So based upon that scenario and thinking about a 600 wide finished bench, BenchEzy will say 600 wide bench plus a 65 millimeter laminate allowance on the roll at the front plus a 10 millimeter allowance for laminate to be trimmed off the rear, which means that BenchEzy will calculate that our cut size for our laminate is 675 millimeters in width. The next one is how much we want BenchEzy to add on to the finished bench size when it allows for our edge strips. Let's assume we have a bench top that's going to finish at 1 meter long, and in this instance here we are telling BenchEzy that we want our edge strip to be finished 40 millimeters longer than the finished size of our bench. So our finished bench size is 1 meter. BenchEzy will calculate that our edge strip length needs to be 1 meter and 40. The next one and the last setting on this particular page is the edge strip width. Now, BenchEzy utilizes the benchtop thickness to calculate this. So let's say we have a 38 mil substrate. What we're telling BenchEzy here by using 15 millimeters is that we want BenchEzy to tell us that our edge strip width needs to be our 38 millimeter benchtop thickness plus 15 millimeters. So BenchEzy will in turn tell us that the cut size for any edge stripping that we need for our benchtop will be 53 millimeters in width. The last section on this page is a little bit of company information. Very basic information, very self-explanatory. The only thing that needs a little bit of an explanation is this setting here for our builder folder naming convention. This will be covered more in the video that will be talking about our customers and jobs area. So just remember that the setting is, remember that this setting lives here on the company defaults area, but we will actually talk about that, what that setting does or doesn't do when we get down to our customers and jobs section. That pretty much covers the default section in the BenchEzy advanced settings. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this video and found it very informative, and that you can take away more information than you came with. Make sure you check out the rest of our videos on our website or on our YouTube channel by searching HUTTOPTY Ltd, which is all one word. Thank you. We'll talk to you next time.